Hey everyone, welcome again. Thank you so much for coming back for another video today. We're going to talk a little bit about nutrition. This is kind of Nutrition 101, very basic on nutrition, and hopefully this will kind of lay the groundwork for future conversations regarding nutrition, regarding kind of more specifics with nutrition. Now hopefully with today's video I'll be able to cover quite a bit of information. This is information that I gathered through my own nutritional education, and then also information that I've gathered in just working with hundreds of clients, and then also doing some nutrition stuff on my own, kind of see what works, see what doesn't work. And so hopefully you'll leave today's video with a pretty good base level of nutrition science that you can kind of implement into your own training, you can implement into your own lifestyle, and hopefully make some really good progress with your body composition that you're looking to do. So let's get right to it. When we're talking about nutrition, we need to think of nutrition in kind of its three main components. Now, of course, there's technically a fourth one considered alcohol when we're thinking about calories, but most of the time when we're thinking about nutrition, we're thinking about protein, carbohydrates, and fats. And the way that these things break down in our body really kind of controls what happens to our body itself. And they really dictate kind of how our body composition looks. And so when we're thinking about protein, 1 gram of a protein consists of about 4 kilocalories, or 4 calories, as that's typically what it's referred to. Carbohydrates, on the other hand, 1 gram equals 4 net calories. And then for fats, 1 gram typically equals 9 grams or 9 calories, so to speak. Now, when we're looking at protein, protein breaks down into amino acids. Of those amino acids, there's 9 that are essential, 11 that are non-essential. Just a quick aside real quick. When your body is building muscle protein through the process called muscle protein synthesis, your body requires all 20 of these to be present at the muscle that it's trying to build. And more on that here in a little bit when we talk about kind of setting up your nutrition throughout the day. Now, as far as carbohydrates, there's a lot more different categories of carbohydrates. There's monosaccharides, there's disaccharides, there's oligosaccharides, there's polysaccharides, and these really just kind of determine how many forms of different types of glucose, fructose, all that type of stuff will kind of get created together. And so these are essentially like chains of different types of carbohydrate all stuck together, and then your body kind of works to disassemble them and break them down. So an example would be like table sugar, for example, is a mixture of 1 part glucose and then 1 part fructose, which is the sugar that you get from fruits. And so when we're consuming table sugar, we're not consuming straight glucose and we're not consuming straight fructose like we would if we were to, let's say, consume an apple or a fruit juice or something like that. But we're getting kind of these different combinations. Well, long story short, your body does a really good job at kind of converting all of that down eventually into glucose. It takes a while, but eventually your body kind of breaks down all of those different forms of carbohydrates, and eventually we get glucose. And then glucose is then used in glycolysis, which is the first part of the Krebs cycle and ATP production, all that fun stuff that we learned in Bio 101 in high school. Well, a little bit more about glucose is when our body senses glucose coming into our bloodstream, or when there is a present increase in glucose in our bloodstream, our body responds by releasing insulin. And insulin is a hormonal response. And when we release insulin, all that insulin does is insulin is essentially a key that opens up our cell that now allows glucose to come into that cell. I'm going to talk a lot more about that at the end when we kind of get into the nitty-gritties of some of this stuff. Fats, on the other hand, 1 gram equals 9 calories. They can come as both saturated and unsaturated. When they're unsaturated, they can be multiple different forms. They can be polyunsaturated fatty acids, they can be monounsaturated fatty acids, they can be all those different types of things. But typically they're also being converted, they're also being broken down, all that type of stuff. And a lot of times they'll end up as triglycerides, and triglycerides are essentially 3 fatty acids with a glycerol component. Glycerol is like the backbone for these fatty acids, so that gets created with the fatty acids, and then that glycerol can actually be broken down into glucose. And that's much more in-depth nutrition science than we want to get to today. So let's just stick to the basics. So we've got protein, carbs, fats, and this is a little bit more about some of the stuff. And I'm sure if you look it up, you can kind of dive more deep into the specifics that are interesting to you. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the specifics later on. So at the end of the day, energy in and energy out equals your body weight. So if you're consuming more total calories or more total kilocalories per day, and you're not outputting that amount of kilocalories, what we will see happen is your body weight will start to rise. And that is the rule of thermodynamics. There's nothing that we can do to change that. As much as I'm sure your favorite social media or a TikToker would want to say, oh, well, you can eat whatever you want and you can maintain this body weight, that's not entirely true. Now, one of the reasons why you probably clicked on today's video is not thinking about nutrition in terms of body weight, but actually thinking about nutrition in terms of body composition. And so that's a really important distinction. Body weight does not equal body composition. You take someone that's 6'2", 220 pounds, that person can look very different. If they're 220 pounds of mostly fat, they're gonna look entirely different than someone that's 220 pounds of, let's say, 5% body fat. There's gonna be a very different type of phenotypic look to that person's physique. And I'm sure that the reason why you clicked on this video today is not to look at nutrition in terms of total body weight changes, but actually in how we can change our body composition, how we can get kind of lean and also gain muscle at the same time. So a couple other terms, BMR is your basal metabolic rate. So essentially this is kind of what your body weight would look like, or I'm sorry, how many calories you would be burning at rest. And so essentially what happens is your BMR is something that stays stable, and this is actually something that you can test at different testing centers, typically centers where they offer like DEXA scans or VO2 max tests. They'll also be able to test for your BMR. It's actually a really cool test. You typically just sit for like an hour with this mask on. It measures your breath output. It can measure how many calories are in each breath, and then over time it kind of gives you a extrapolated data of like, okay, over the course of one day at rest without doing any type of activity, this is how many calories you would burn. And so with all of that said, on days that you're active, on days that you're moving around and using your body, not just lying on the couch all day, you're gonna actually burn a lot more calories. On the days that you're passive, days that you're, let's say, sleeping all day, laying on the couch all day, whatever it may be, you're gonna kind of just burn whatever your BMR is set at. So hopefully that all makes sense. Let's kind of proceed to the next topic. So when we're thinking about these things, when we're thinking about body composition changes, when we're thinking about food in general, we need to be considering food in different categories. And so I want you guys to be able to walk away with something that you can actually implement into your own current day-to-day. And so hopefully this will make things a little bit simpler. So when we're thinking of protein, we think of beef, chicken, eggs, fish, protein shakes, and yogurt. I do not want to hear that peanut butter is a source of protein. It is not. It is a good source of fat. It is not a good source of protein. Carbohydrates, rice, oats, breads, pasta, fruits, veggies, and beans, and then fats, nuts, seeds, oils, and then fats from meat, because that's also a very important thing that I think also gets overlooked. So for example, beef. If you're looking at beef, let's take ground beef for example. If you're looking at an 80-20% ground beef, it's gonna have a lot more fat in it than, let's say, something that's a 93-7% ground beef. So this is really important because when we're choosing a protein source, we want to be choosing a protein source. We don't want to be choosing a fat source as well. Now there are situations where we would want to choose both a fat and a protein source at the same time. I'll talk more about that when it comes to meal planning, but just to very simply put it, we want to focus on one macro ingredients. So yes, when we consume beef, even when we're consuming 93-7% ground beef, we're still going to be getting a little bit of fat, but we're getting mostly protein versus an 80-20% ground beef. We're going to be getting a lot more fat than we are getting protein. So that's important to kind of think about when we're making these meal selections. Fats, on the other hand, they can both come as saturated and unsaturated fats, and I think that's another important thing. Most of the meat fats that we're going to be looking at are going to be saturated forms of fat. Those are very not good for cholesterol, for heart health, for all that type of stuff. That's a separate video, a whole separate topic that we'll talk about when it comes to cholesterol, because I do think that there's a ton of myths being promoted on social media about cholesterol either being good for you, bad for you, whatever, and we'll get to the nitty-gritty on that on a later video. Oils, on the other hand, are mostly unsaturated. There is an exception. Coconut oil, for example, is a saturated fat. That's why it's solid at room temperature. And that's really what the difference between saturated and unsaturated. If it's solid at room temperature, it's a saturated fat. If it's unsolid or not solid at room temperature, it's an unsaturated fat. So when we're thinking about meals, we want to be thinking about these different things. We also want to be thinking about something that I had on the other page that I didn't really talk about, and that's fiber. Now, when it comes to carbohydrates, some carbohydrates have a ton of fiber, some carbohydrates have little fiber. So for example, rice, like a jasmine white rice, has a very low amount of fiber, but for example, a brown rice would have a lot more fiber than a jasmine white rice. Oats, for example, you get whole rolled oats, that's gonna have a very different amount of fiber than, let's say, instant oats or pre-cooked oats. Breads, depending on the bread that you choose, you can get a high fiber bread, a low fiber bread, and you just look at the nutrition panel on the pack and it'll tell you, which is kind of cool. Pasta, there's whole fiber pasta, whole grain pasta, all that type of stuff. You can get high fiber, low fiber. Fruits, certain fruits have more fiber than others. You can Google it. Veggies, same thing. Beans typically have a lot more fiber than some of the other categories, and so I put those kind of at the bottom for a reason, and I'll talk about that here. So next, we want to look at meal planning and meal preparation. So fats and fibers equal slow digestion. When you consume a lot of fiber, it slows down your digestion, makes your digestion actually a lot better, but it does slow down your digestion. Same thing with fats. Fats also tend to slow down your digestion. Carbohydrates, these equal energy. When you consume carbohydrates, your body is going to have more fuel for performance. Protein, always. We always want every single meal to have some form of protein in it. The satiety, this is essentially how full you feel. When you consume a lot of protein, when you consume a lot of fiber, or when you consume a lot of fat, you will get the feeling of being full. You will go longer periods of time without feeling hungry. So this is all really important when it comes to meal planning. And so the reason I bring this up is if we're writing a meal plan for either ourselves or for someone else, let's say this is meal number one. Meal number one can look a lot different depending on the situation, depending on the context. So let's say there's a person named Joe, and Joe likes to go to the gym first thing in the morning. So he wakes up, he eats, and then he goes directly to the gym. In Joe's situation, that first meal that he's having, we're not going to want a ton of fiber, we're not going to want a ton of fat, because those are going to slow down digestion. The last thing we want Joe to have happen is for that blood flow in his body to be allocated towards digestion and the digestive processes while he's trying to get a pump in the gym, because it's going to cause him to not allocate that blood to the place that he wants it to go. On the flip side, Joe's probably going to want a high amount of carbohydrates first thing in the morning, because that's going to give him the energy for his workout. And then protein, since we're always having protein, we're going to have protein in that meal. So for Joe's first meal in this situation, we're going to do, let's say, 2 whole eggs, which is going to equal about 12 grams of fat. So some fat, but relatively on the lower end. We're going to have about 12 grams of protein from this. And that's going to be it that we're going to get from the eggs, assuming that he cooks them in, like, let's say a spray oil or something like that. If he was cooking them in butter, for example, that amount of fat would definitely go up. So that's first. Next, we're going to get more protein, so we're going to do 4 egg whites. Now, typically, we see about 4 grams of protein per egg white, so we can get about 16 more grams of protein from that alone. And then we're going to do, excuse me, let's do some carbohydrates. So we're going to do some carbohydrates with a little bit of fiber in them, not a ton. So we're going to do, let's say, half a cup of oatmeal. And we're going to choose instant oats, oats that have been pre-cooked so there's even less fiber in them. Instant oatmeal. And typically with half a cup, if I remember correctly, we get about 36 grams of carbs. And then only like, hold on, let me check the nutrition label real quick. I'm sorry, I was incorrect. So 27 grams of carbs and 4 grams of fat. Or I'm sorry, 4 grams of fiber. And then we're going to need some more carbohydrates. We want kind of lower fiber carbohydrates. So let's add in, let's say half a cup of blueberries. And then let's also do, let's say 40 grams of honey, which is kind of straight glucose. So between the half cup of blueberries, we should get about 18 grams of carbs. And then with the honey, we should equal about, let's see. So with honey, we're going to hit about 36 grams of carbs. So let's add all this up together. So we've got about 12 grams of fat. We've got 12 plus 16. So we've got 28 grams of protein. And then we've got 27 plus 18. So that's going to be 45 plus 36, 51, 81. So you've got 81 grams of carbs. So altogether, we've got a pretty balanced, definitely leaning more into the carbs, which is good considering that he's going to the gym after this meal. We've got lower fiber, so fiber, we've got 4 grams of fiber, and I'm sure that there's some grams of fiber in the blueberries, but I'm not calculating those. So we've got 4 grams of fiber. So this is his first meal. Now his next meal immediately post-workout, or within about an hour of finishing his workout, we're gonna want him to mostly leverage carbohydrates and protein. So now we've hit carbohydrates and protein pretty hard first thing in the morning, but that's good because he's active, he's moving, he's going to the gym, he's getting his day started, he's going to work directly after the gym, maybe showering at the gym, then going directly to work. So it's good for us to load up on carbohydrates at that time frame. Now throughout the rest of the day, when Joe is going to be, let's say, sitting in his office, not necessarily active, we're going to want to leverage some of this other stuff that we've been looking at. So we're going to want to keep protein consistent, let's say aiming for between 30 to 40 grams of protein per meal, but we're going to want to change how it works throughout the rest of the day. So we have a protein shake, let's say we have 2 pieces of, or two bananas post-workout, so that gets us around 60 grams of carbs. Let's assume he's doing 2 scoops of protein, so we get around 50 grams of protein. And then throughout the rest of the day, we're focusing on, let's say, fat loss. So we're trying to eat more satiety-inducing foods, or more satisfying foods. So we're gonna want to leverage more of the protein, the fats, and the fibers. And we've already hit a ton of carbs kind of first thing in the morning, so we'll actually keep most of the rest of the day relatively lower in carbohydrates. So an example of this would be, let's say, for meal number 3, so he had his first meal, he had his post-workout shake. Meal number 3, he's gonna have a piece of salmon, which has got a great amount of protein and then also a good amount of healthy fats, high amounts of omegas, all that type of stuff. And then with that protein, he's gonna have some veggies, and then he's gonna have a little bit of beans, so higher fiber carbohydrates, relatively lower in the actual carbohydrate department. Later on in that day, he's gonna have some chicken, and then with that chicken, he's gonna have some, whole wheat pasta to emphasize fiber intake and emphasize satiety with that. Maybe put a little bit of oil on top, some extra virgin olive oil, some seasonings, that type of stuff. But that's basically how he's gonna set up the rest of his day. It's kind of lower carbohydrates, higher fiber, maybe moderate fats, and then definitely hitting protein kind of with each one of those meals. Now on the flip side, let's say it's someone that's training in the evening. So in the evening, if you're training at that time of day, you're gonna wanna allocate most of your carbohydrates, and more importantly, most of your sugary, less fibrous carbohydrates towards the end of the day. And then throughout the morning, you're gonna wanna have mostly your fats, fibers, proteins, those types of things. And then as you get closer to the gym, we'll see those carbohydrates start to spike up, and then protein stay consistent, but then the fats and the fibers start to come down since we're getting closer to the gym. And then all that being said, when we're looking at kind of the total energy balance, let's say that Joe, for example, so I'm gonna come over here real quick. Let's say we've got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday. Let's say Joe goes to the gym on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. He takes off on Tuesday, takes off on Thursday, and then takes off on Sunday. Well, in this situation, Joe is going to want to prioritize higher carbohydrates on these days. But let's say if Joe's goal is to lose body fat, he's going to want to do lower carbohydrates on these days, and then also just lower net calories on those days as well. So typically the way that we do this, or the way that I do this, is I do a training day and non-training day diet. And so the way that this looks, and I'll come over here real quick, is we're going to look at a training day, and that always reminds me of the old Denzel Washington movie, Training Day, a non-training day, great movie, Training Day. Okay, so I'm gonna take myself as an example in this situation. So for me personally, I've been consuming 350 grams of protein per day, and that's gonna remain consistent for both of these days. So when it comes to protein, I've got 350 grams and 350 grams. Why? Because I always want to be building muscle. Next come carbohydrates. For carbohydrates, I'm going to do 700 grams on my training days, and then on my non-training days, I'm going to cut that in half. I'm going to do 350 grams of carbohydrates on those days. The reason why is I want to maintain a lean physique while I'm trying to gain weight in the aggregate. So overall, I want my body weight to be going up week over week. But at the same time, I don't need those extra carbohydrates on my rest days. I'm still getting 350 grams, which is more than enough for just kind of maintenance, energy, all that type of stuff. And then for fats, the way that I do my fats is I'm gonna do 90 grams on my training days, and then on my non-training days, I'm gonna go up to 120 grams. And the reason being is on those non-training days, I'm typically doing less meals because I'm not having like an intra-workout meal or something like that. But I do want to feel more satiated. I want to feel more full throughout the day because I'm going to be eating less carbohydrates. So increasing that that fat is definitely going to help. Then on training days, I'm aiming for about 25 grams of fiber. And then on my non-training days, I'm aiming for about 35 to 40 grams of fiber. And that's again because I want my digestion slower on those non-training days. And then on the days that I am going to the gym, I want my digestion as efficient and as effective as possible. So I want to do lower fiber on those days. So that's kind of looking at my own personal macros. And again, it's going to be very different for you. I do weigh about 310 pounds. So very different macros for me versus the average individual. But for you, for yourself, let's take it this way. So let's look at, and again, these are kind of just generalized recommendations. These are not specific for you. If you want to book a consultation with me, reach out to my email and do so in my bio, and we can talk more specifically. But for protein, we're going to do body weight times 1.2. The reason being, you will see a lot of people out there saying that is too much protein, and it might be. But going back to what I said earlier, and I said that this was going to come in handy later, when we're talking about muscle growth, we need all 20 amino acids to be present at the site of muscle protein synthesis at the time that we're trying to create and generate more muscle tissue. So because of that, we want higher protein at all times throughout our system, and I'm very adamant about that. The other thing that's true about protein is a thermogenic macromolecule. What that means is when your body is in the process of breaking down protein, your body is actually burning energy, burning calories in the process of creating, is in the process of breaking down protein. Furthermore, any excess protein that your body has is going to be converted to carbohydrates, which is another thermogenic conversion, meaning it takes energy resources to create carbohydrates from protein through the process called gluconeogenesis. We won't go into that today, but just understand that a little bit extra protein is not going to kill you. As long as your kidneys are safe, as long as you're drinking plenty of water, your blood pressure is under control, there's no concerns about that. Carbohydrates. On your training day, we're going to aim for 1.5 times body weight. So let's say you weigh 200 pounds. On your training days, we're going to aim for 300 carbohydrates. On your non-training days, we're going to aim for 0.8 times body weight. So if you're 200 pounds again, that's going to look like around 160 grams of carbohydrates. Fats, on the other hand, we want no less than 60, and we want no greater than 150. Anything in between is up to you. So play around with those doses, see where you feel best at. And when it comes to the aggregate of all of this type of stuff, you're not going to know what diet's going to work for you when it comes to weight loss or when it comes to weight gain until you put it into practice. And so what I would recommend is I would recommend going through this list, creating a meal plan for yourself that says, hey, for meal number 1, I'm going to have chicken, or for eggs, or whatever it may be. For meal number 2, I'm going to have beef. For meal number 3, I'm going to have this. For meal number 4, I'm going to have that. And then do the same thing with each one of these. So for me, I like to have eggs first thing in the morning, so I'm going to do eggs. I'm going to do oats first thing in the morning. I like them because they're warm, they're sweet. I add some honey, some blueberries, all that type of stuff. And then for fats, I'm going to do egg yolks because I like the taste of them. I'm going to do a little bit of coconut oil in my eggs, and then I'm going to do maybe a little bit of olive oil in the pan that I'm cooking my eggs in. So that's how I'm going to get my fats for that meal. For meal number 2, I really like chicken, so I'm going to do chicken. I'm going to do some asparagus for fiber. I'm going to do some white rice. I'm going to top it off with a little bit of olive oil. For meal number 3, I'm going to do this. For meal number 4, I'm going to do that. Anyways, you get the basics. So essentially, I'm selecting from these. I'm creating them out. I'm thinking about what time of day I'm going to the gym so that I can kind of reconcile all of that with fiber intake, with fat intake around the gym session so that I'm not overburdening my digestive system with a ton of fiber before going to the gym or directly after the gym when my body should be allocating that blood flow in the body towards the muscle that I'm trying to train or that I've just recently trained. And then I'm stacking the fiber and the fats kind of throughout the rest of the day away from my training window. Where was I going with that? But yeah, so essentially what you do is you create your meal plan and then you weigh yourself a week later and you say, I've gone up in weight or I've gone down in weight. If your goal is weight loss and you've gone down in weight, kudos, keep up the same diet. If your goal is weight loss and your weight's staying the same or your weight's going up, we need to look at the carbohydrates. We then need to drop your carbohydrates on your training days, on your non-training days, or we need to drop your fats on both of those days. We're gonna keep the protein the same because again, we want to support muscle and we want to support muscle whether in a caloric surplus or in a caloric deficit. Yes, there is a reason to be said that in a caloric surplus, you probably don't need as much protein. Again, that's a separate topic for a different video. That's pretty much everything I've got on my mind today. I hope that helps in some capacity with kind of understanding nutrition, understanding how to allocate your nutrition throughout the day, specifically around your workout window so that you're not overburdening your digestive system with any of these types of things. Hopefully this food list helps out. If your question for me is, oh, I don't see this on the food list, should I still consume this? Or, I've been eating this and not eating that. Just try these foods for a little bit of time, see how it makes you feel. And then see what happens to your body weight. If your body weight's trending in the wrong direction, we need to change either fats or carbs. If your body weight's trending in the right direction, just keep up the good work. Comment below if you have any questions. Shoot me an email at my email in my bio if you want to do lab work through Merrick Health. And if you want to just hop on a console call to talk about your nutrition, drop a comment below and I'll reach out. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Enjoy the rest of your Monday and have a great rest of your week.